A number of African Americans say they are considering leaving the United States and relocating to Africa. Those who've made the move cite the need to connect with their history and find a better life. And while Trump's not a direct reason to leave, they say the political environment.
Let me tell you, black people love Trump. I got the biggest vote. I got the biggest vote with black people. They know a scam better than anybody. They know what it is to be scammed. Thank you, man. Thank you. I appreciate it. We did great. Thank you. I like this guy.
We begin this hour with the story of an African country opening its arms to black Americans. Ghana's tourism minister began encouraging African Americans to move there in 2019. As Black Lives Matter protests erupted, she said, quote, "You don't have to stay where you're not wanted."
America never imagined this would happen. Not protests, not politics, but people leaving quietly, deliberately, and for good. Across the United States, Black Americans are packing skills, savings, and ambition and choosing Africa instead. Not out of anger, but clarity. Because staying started to feel like surviving, not building. While the U.S. debates the future, Africa is offering one: cities growing, opportunities expanding, dignity without negotiation. And this isn't a trend driven by nostalgia, it's driven by calculation. And when a country begins losing its own people, not to war, not to poverty, but to possibilities, something far deeper is breaking.
I wouldn't go back. For $100 an hour job, I wouldn't go back. I would not go back at all. Getting up in the morning, doing what you have to do, and rushing to go and punch the clock to make somebody else rich. You get to decide what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, how you're going to do it. And us, we work really hard. So it pays off because we're working for ourselves instead of giving all our energy and everything to somebody.
Years for Anne-Marie Crawford to become an American citizen after she left Jamaica, where she was born.
I don't think we are really welcome there, just to work and put money in their pockets.
She's lived with her family in Atlanta for nearly 30 years. Now President Trump's back in office, she wants out. She says they've felt warmly welcomed here in Nairobi, where they've come to buy a home.
This is a prime area.
Adila Mohammed's helping.
I get asked all the time, why would you leave the USA to come to Africa? Or specifically Namibia, if it's a Namibian asking. I realize a lot of people don't know the experience of what a Black American looks like. But the first answer is, it's spiritual. This is the land that my ancestors are from. I am from African ancestry, and this is where I believe I belong.
The movement did not begin with headlines. It began quietly in conversations that crossed dinner tables, online forums, and late-night phone calls. Across the United States, a growing number of Black Americans were asking the same question, though rarely aloud: what if the future no longer lived here? Africa was not presented as an escape. It was framed as a return to possibility. For decades, the United States had described itself as a land of opportunity, yet many Black Americans increasingly felt that opportunity had become conditional, fragile, and unevenly distributed. Economic progress stalled, home ownership gaps widened, wealth accumulation lagged behind inflation, even success carried exhaustion. Africa, meanwhile, was changing. The image many Americans held of Africa no longer matched reality. Infrastructure expanded, technology hubs emerged, cultural confidence surged. Countries once described only in terms of aid were now speaking in the language of growth, leverage, and long-term planning. The contrast was impossible to ignore. In the United States, Black Americans watched social tension rise while economic security weakened. Education costs climbed, healthcare remained unpredictable, political rhetoric grew louder while solutions grew thinner. For many, the promise of inclusion felt perpetually delayed. Africa offered something different, not perfection. Not certainty, but participation. Several African countries began implementing diaspora engagement policies. Investment pathways opened, residency programs expanded, dual citizenship discussions surfaced. These were not symbolic gestures. They were strategic. Africa did not frame Black Americans as victims. It framed them as assets. That distinction mattered. In the United States, Black Americans often felt required to prove belonging. In Africa, belonging was assumed, even if familiarity was not. Cultural gaps existed, but curiosity replaced suspicion. The idea of moving was not sudden. It grew slowly, fueled by comparison. Black Americans noticed that professional skills stretched further abroad. A salary that struggled to stabilize life in major U.S. cities created flexibility elsewhere. Entrepreneurship faced fewer legacy barriers. Communities were forming intentionally, not reactively. Africa was not pulling people in with slogans. The United States was pushing them out through stagnation. The push factors were subtle but cumulative: rising housing costs without corresponding wage growth, corporate layoffs that erased decades of loyalty. Education systems burdened by debt rather than empowerment, a sense that effort no longer guaranteed mobility. Africa's pull was equally understated. Opportunity felt expandable. Growth curves were steeper. Being early mattered. Participation meant shaping outcomes rather than adapting to them. Black Americans who relocated did not describe abandoning the United States in anger. They described leaving in realism. The United States, they felt, was no longer built for their ascent. It was built for their endurance. Africa, by contrast, was still building, and builders were welcome. Countries across West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa began noticing patterns. Diaspora arrivals brought capital, skills, and global networks. Local economies benefited. Cultural exchange accelerated, expectations adjusted. This was not a brain drain from the United States in the traditional sense. It was a reallocation of belief. Black Americans were no longer convinced that waiting would produce change. Africa represented agency, the ability to invest effort where returns felt proportional. The decision was rarely framed as permanent. Many spoke of dual lives, circular migration, or long-term experimentation, but even temporary relocation altered perspective. Distance revealed what proximity had normalized. The United States began to feel heavy. Africa felt unfinished, and unfinished meant open. Critics questioned the movement. They warned of bureaucracy, infrastructure, gaps, and cultural adjustment. Those challenges existed. But Black Americans moving to Africa did not expect ease. They expected fairness. What they found was not uniform. Some countries moved faster than others. Some policies lagged behind rhetoric. Some integration efforts stumbled, but the direction was clear. Africa was positioning itself as a future-facing destination, the United States. Meanwhile, appeared trapped in cycles. Cycles of debate without resolution, growth without distribution, representation without security. Black Americans did not leave because they stopped caring. They left because they started calculating. Time, energy, and ambition were finite. Africa offered a different return on all three. The phrase "losing its own people" gained traction, not because of numbers alone, but because of symbolism. When citizens choose possibility elsewhere, something fundamental has shifted. Africa did not ask for loyalty, it offered alignment, and alignment, once found, is difficult to abandon. The movement was still small relative to population size, but movements are not measured by scale at the beginning, they are measured by direction. And the direction, quietly but clearly, was changing. As the movement expanded, its impact began to register beyond individual decisions. Communities formed, networks strengthened. What initially appeared as isolated relocations gradually revealed a pattern shaped by economics, psychology, and long-term planning. African countries did not treat this shift as accidental, they studied it. Across the continent, governments and private sectors noticed that Black Americans arriving were not seeking aid or charity. They arrived with savings, education, professional experience, and global exposure. They were not fleeing hardship alone. They were pursuing leverage. That distinction reshaped engagement. Residency frameworks were streamlined. Property ownership rules were clarified. Business registration processes adapted to attract diaspora capital without undermining local participation. Africa framed the movement not as repatriation, but as partnership. The United States observed quietly. Official narratives emphasized choice and mobility. There was little acknowledgement that something structural was happening. Migration was framed as lifestyle preference rather than systemic response, yet indicators suggested otherwise. Remittance flows reversed direction, investment capital moved outward rather than inward, cultural production followed the people, media, art, and technology increasingly referenced African cities as centers of innovation. Rather than nostalgia, the shift challenged assumptions. For generations, migration followed a single arc toward the United States. Now that arc bent back, not completely, not uniformly, but enough to disrupt expectations. Black Americans relocating spoke of psychological relief. The constant negotiation of identity softened. They were no longer required to justify belonging. While cultural differences existed, race was not a daily battlefield. That absence created space for focus. Africa offered room to build without defending existence. That freedom translated into productivity. Entrepreneurs launched ventures aimed at regional markets rather than global approval. Educators collaborated with local institutions. Technologists adapted solutions to infrastructure realities instead of forcing imported models. This was not charity-driven development. It was co-creation. Africa benefited materially. Job creation increased. Knowledge transfer accelerated. Local supply chains expanded at the same time. African societies retained agency. The relationship was not extractive, it was negotiated. The United States, however, felt the loss in subtler ways. Talent shortages grew in sectors already under pressure. Cultural influence diluted as creators operated outside American frameworks. Soft power weakened when narratives no longer centered the United States as the default destination. The phrase losing its own people took on layered meaning. It was not simply about departure, it was about disillusionment. Black Americans did not feel expelled. They felt uninvited to the future. The United States remained familiar, but familiarity no longer outweighed stagnation. Africa represented motion. Challenges persisted. Infrastructure gaps tested patience. Regulatory systems required navigation. Integration demanded humility. But those challenges felt transitional, not terminal. In the United States, challenges felt entrenched. That contrast mattered. African societies also underwent reflection. Some questioned whether diaspora arrivals would raise costs or displace locals. Others worried about cultural dilution. These conversations unfolded openly. Policies adjusted accordingly. Africa did not romanticize the movement. It managed it. Local partnerships were encouraged. Skills transfer was emphasized. Community integration. Programs evolved. The goal was sustainability, not spectacle. This pragmatic approach reinforced trust. Black Americans moving to Africa felt neither elevated nor marginalized. They felt included with expectations. That balance fostered long-term commitment. Over time, feedback loops emerged. Success stories encouraged others. Challenges prompted preparation rather than deterrence. Information circulated faster. The movement matured. The United States, meanwhile, struggled to respond. Addressing root causes required structural reform: housing affordability, wealth inequality, labor security, healthcare access. These issues demanded political courage that remained scarce. Instead, the movement was often minimized. Africa was framed as a temporary experiment. Return was assumed, but assumptions rarely survive data. Those who left did not burn bridges, they built alternatives. Africa became a second center of gravity rather than a detour. The psychological impact was profound. For the first time in generations, Black Americans felt they had options beyond endurance. Choice replaced survival, planning replaced waiting. That shift could not be reversed easily. The United States had long benefited from the loyalty of people who stayed despite inequity. That loyalty was no longer guaranteed. Africa did not demand allegiance. It offered opportunity aligned with dignity. As the movement continued, it reshaped identities on both sides of the Atlantic. Black Americans redefined success beyond American validation. Africa redefined diaspora engagement beyond symbolism. The result was not abandonment, it was recalibration. The United States was not rejected outright, it was no longer assumed. And when a nation stops being assumed, it begins to compete. Africa understood that. The United States was still learning. The movement remained young, evolving, and diverse in outcome, but one truth had become undeniable. People moved toward futures that welcomed them, and increasingly, Africa was doing exactly that.